Hi, thanks for joining me today with another podcast of the Apologist Bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. I don't know how I managed to overlook this book for so long. It's one of Lee Strobel's books. He's the author of The Case for Christ and all sorts of The Case for books. This is his second one, called The Case for Faith. And subtitle, A Journalist Investigates the Toughest Objections to Christianity. We used this book with our apologetics class, and we all got so much out of it. It deals with 8 objections to Christianity, and these are hugely important ones. Number 1, since evil and suffering exist, a loving God cannot. Number 2, since miracles contradict science, they can't be true. 3, evolution explains life, so God isn't needed. 4, God isn't worthy of worship if he kills innocent children. 5, it's offensive to claim Jesus is the only way to God. Boy, is that popular today. 6, a loving God would never torture people in hell. 7, church history is littered with oppression and violence. And then the last one, I still have doubts, so I can't be a Christian. Well, that's Strobel's book, Powerful. I would like to look at objection number 4, which is, let's see, get it started here. God isn't worthy of worship if he kills innocent children. And he quotes from people like Robert Wilson. The Bible tells us to be like God. And then on page after page, it describes God as a mass murderer. And so Strobel sits down with Norm Geisler, a very well-known Christian apologist. And he says, we're getting God's image being called into question. We got these stories of seemingly cruel and vengeful behavior. Is that the way God really is? Does he deserve to be worshipped? He said when he was an atheist, Strobel said the big hurdles for him were 2. The character of God, in other words, God is a bully or a vindictive being, and the reliability of the book that supposedly tells about it. He said those were the 2 major hurdles he had. So he sits down with Norm Geisler. By the way, wouldn't that be fun? Strobel is an investigative journalist, so he gets access, but wouldn't that be fun to sit down with some of the best minds that are apologists and just be able to ask them the kind of questions that you would have and hear their answers? So he sits down with Geisler. Geisler has since passed away, so we have to go to Geisler's books to hear his voice these days. He said, Dr. Geisler, Thomas Paine wrote in his book, The Age of Reason, whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the work of a demon than the work of God. So Geisler is challenged with that, of course. And it says Geisler responds with a chuckle. He says, first of all, I'd say, too bad he didn't have a Bible. It says, I think he's confusing 2 things, what the Bible records and what the Bible approves. He said, for example, and what do we have in the Bible? We've got a lot of lives of Satan, and we've got David's adultery as an example, but it doesn't approve of those things. It says the book of Judges has a woman who's raped, she's cut into pieces, sent to one piece to each of the tribes. He said the Bible doesn't approve of that. But Geisler also says Paine is just factually wrong. The Bible doesn't have any cruel and torturous executions that God commanded. Strobel says, well, there's still a lot of carnage in the Old Testament. Isn't there a big difference between the cruel God of the Old Testament and the loving God of the New Testament? Geisler says, well, it's funny you'd ask that because Geisler did a study of the word mercy. And he said it occurred 261 times in the Bible, and 72% of them are in the Old Testament. So the word mercy is way more in the Old Testament than the New Testament. Then he looked up the word love, because you think of that as associated with the New Testament, but he said it was about half in the Old and the New, the word. He said, actually, Geisler is saying you can make a case that God is more judgmental in the New Testament. He says, for example, the Old Testament doesn't talk much about eternal punishment, but the New Testament does. Well, Strobel wants to get him into the area about the destroying the Canaanites, because that's becoming a popular challenge to Christians these days, the call for genocide. Said that wasn't an isolated instance, that God ordered the execution of every Egyptian firstborn. He flooded the world. He told the Israelites, go attack the Amalekites, destroy everything that belongs to them, don't spare anything. Put to death men and women and children and infants and cattle and sheep and camels and donkeys. So that sounds like a pretty brutal God. And Geisler said, well, it shows that God's character is absolutely holy and he has to punish sin and rebellion. He's righteous. So Geisler says, well, let's take a look at the Amalekites. He said they were far from innocent. He said they were horrible people. They were totally depraved. Their mission was to destroy Israel. In other words, they were the ones committing genocide. He said they had been following the Israelites, been slaughtering the most vulnerable among them, the weak and the elderly who were lagging behind. He said they were a vicious people. Well, then Strobel says, but why would the innocent kids need to be killed? Geisler says, well, let's keep in mind, technically nobody is innocent. God, and then he says, this is a big point that Geisler's going to come back to more than once. God created life, and he has the right to take it. If you can create life, then you have the right to take it. But if you can't create it, you don't have that right. Said people assume that what's right for us is right for God, what's wrong for us is wrong for God. But said it's wrong for me to take your life. I didn't make it. I don't own it. I can't go into your yard and pull up your bushes, cut them down, and transplant them or do anything. I could do that in my yard. I own those bushes. So he says God is sovereign over all of life. He has the right to take it if he wishes. He said, we tend to forget that God takes the life of every human being. It's called death. That's a pretty good response. So Strobel comes back to the kids, though, again. He said, but the children. And so Geisler says, well, Lee, in the Amalekites, he said there was no hope for these kids. It was a polluted nation. God's action was an act of mercy. And Strobel says, really? How's that? So Geisler says, well, according to the Bible, every child who dies before the age of accountability goes to heaven to spend eternity in the presence of God. Well, then Strobel interrupts, well, what makes you think children go to heaven when they die? And this is very comforting, isn't it, if you think about this, if this is right? And I think he makes a pretty good case here. Now, he doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but here's what Geisler says. Look at Isaiah 7:16. It talks about an age before a child is morally accountable, before the child, quote, knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, unquote. King David spoke of going to be with his son, who died at birth. And Jesus said, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. That indicates they'll go to heaven. He said there are other scriptures that will support that position as well. Okay, so I'll move past that one. What about the Canaanites as well? They were awful people. And the Canaanites, and this is something important, I think, Geisler's pointing out, the Canaanites and the Amalekites had 400 years to repent. They were given 400 years. What about the Canaanites? Geisler says they were into brutality, cruelty, incest, bestiality, cultic prostitution. They even killed their children through child sacrifice by fire. And they wanted to annihilate the Israelites. He said, now, they were evil people, no doubt, but even the righteous among them were saved. We have that story of Rahab. She was not judged with the other people. Look what happened to the corrupt residents of Nineveh. That was a terrible place. But what happened? They repented, and God saved the whole bunch. So Geisler says it comes down to this. Whoever has repented, God has been willing to save. That's huge. He said God's purpose was to destroy the corrupt nation because that structure was evil, not to destroy the people if they're willing to repent. So I thought that was a good point. Something else that Geisler brings up, he says, consider this. Most of the women and children probably would have fled in advance before the fighting began, so it was the warriors. And they were the tough ones, the ones who had stubbornly refused to leave. They're the ones that were the carriers of the corrupt culture. So the question is really, how many women and children might actually have been involved anyway? Another point that Geisler brings up, he said, under the rules of conduct that God had given to the Israelites, whenever they went to an enemy city, they first would make the people an offer of peace. The people had a choice. They could accept that offer, then they wouldn't be killed, or they could reject that offer at their own peril. He said, that's appropriate, and that seems fair. And that is a good point. So what's Geisler's key point here? God is not capricious. He's not arbitrary. He's not cruel, but he is just. His nature demands he has to deal with corrupt people. Now, let me stop at this point because Paul Copan has dealt with this in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? And he adds a lot of details to this. I know you'd get a lot out of it. I won't take the time now because I don't want to go off on another book. But there are a lot of other reasons to believe God is not a moral monster. So I will leave it at that as far as this part of his chapter. Then let me move to a new point here. I was trying to see what else he covers in here. Oh, what about the pain of animals? You got a God that created everything, and he puts animals through a lot of pain and death. And so that was brought up by a man named Charles Templeton. He wrote a book called Farewell to God. He said all life is predicated on death. Every carnivorous creature has to kill, devour other creatures. How could a loving God create such horrors? And Geisler said, yes, God did create animals. And it said, we're told God originally created animals and humans to be herbivorous. And so he goes to Genesis. God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth. They'll be yours for food. Everything has life and breath in it, et cetera, et cetera. And he says that was the way it was set up. God did not appoint animals to be eaten in paradise, and animals were not eating each other. He says everything God created was good. What changed was the fall. And what happened, God, in Romans 8, it says all creation was affected by the fall. And that would be plant life and humans and genetic changes and the lifespans decreasing. God didn't want it to be that way, but it was because of sin. And so let me just stop for just a second. There are different ways to interpret the Romans 8 passage. I know Hugh Ross and old earthers think that the animals that were created to be predators did probably prey on things in the beginning of the creation, and that the fall allowed death to come to humans, but there'd already been death in animals. So I'm just telling you there is a different way to interpret Romans 8. But this is Geisler. He's probably a young earth person who thinks the earth is very recent, and so he's coming down that way. Strobel says, well, what about instituting the animal sacrifice system? Wasn't that cruelty to animals? And Geisler says, no, it was humane. It was a painless way to die, and there was no waste. They ate the meat. They used the skin for clothing. They were basically growing and harvesting animals. It wasn't trying to eliminate a species. And Geisler goes on to say the Bible clearly forbids the abuse of animals. So let's do this. There's so much more in this book. I think I'll do a little bit more, but it's a long chapter. And the next thing is, can we trust the Bible? So first of all, can you trust God? Is this the kind of God you want to trust? And now, can you trust the Bible? Geisler says there's more evidence the Bible is a reliable source than for any other book from the ancient world. He said all sorts of ways to think about that. The Bible's unity is pretty amazing. The Bible's transforming power. But he said, I want to focus especially on convincing evidence. There's archaeological evidence of the Bible's reliability, and then there's miraculous confirmation of its divine authority. So maybe what I'll just do is the first one. What's one reason we can trust the Bible? Archaeology. He said there have been thousands, not hundreds, thousands of archaeological finds in the Middle East that support the picture of the biblical record. Now we know there was a King David, the patriarchs. One time they were considered legendary, but now we're corroborating many of their stories. At one time people said the story of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. It's got to be mythological, but it says, now we found evidence that all 5 of those cities mentioned in Genesis were situated just where the Old Testament said. As far as the destruction, there's an archaeologist who said there's a permanent evidence of a great conflagration that took place during that time period. Geisler goes on, various aspects of the Jewish captivity have been confirmed. We know about the Assyrians. We know about the tunnel in Jerusalem during David's reign. The site of Solomon's temple is being excavated, going on and on and on. Yeah, how about something even in the Old Testament? He says, Samuel says after Saul's death, his armor was put in the temple of Ashtaroth. While Chronicles said, well, his head was put in the temple of the Philistine corn god named Dagon. Now, archaeologists said, well, there's got to be an error there. Was the armor, was there one temple to Ashtaroth and another temple to a Dagon? And said, no, They didn't think enemies would have had temples in the same place at the same time. But what the archaeologists have found, there were two temples at that site and in that place, one for Dagon and one for Ashtaroth. They were separated by a hallway. So the Bible got that right. What about the Hittites? Well, critics said, oh, there's no evidence of such a people. They're in the Bible, but that's the only place. Well, now they've been digging in modern Turkey. Guess what they discovered? The Hittites. He quotes a famous archaeologist, William Albright. He said, there can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. Well, what about the New Testament? Lee brings up. And here's what Geisler said. There's a noted Roman historian, Colin Hemer, Hemer. He showed in his book how archaeology has confirmed not dozens, but hundreds and hundreds of details from the biblical account of the early church. Things like how deep the water was in a certain space from shore, and how the wind blew, and what kind of disease an island had, the names for local officials, and on and on. Acts was authorized by the historian Luke. That man Himmer, the archaeologist, he gives more than a dozen reasons for why Acts had to have been written before 62 A.D. And even earlier, of course, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. And so now you've got Acts being written by Luke in the 60s, which means his Gospel would have to be earlier. So we're getting pretty close to the time of Jesus. Well, then Lee Strobel says, but maybe this Himmer is just the only guy that says that. And Geisler says, oh, no. You've got a prominent historian, Sir William Ramsay. He started out as a skeptic, but after studying Acts, he concluded the details of the narrative have marvelous truth. And then there was a classical historian at Oxford, Sherwin White. He said, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming, and any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Fascinating. All right, so how about I will stop at this point. There's a lot to do. Maybe I'll do the next podcast to continue the chapter, because I hate to leave off in the middle of it. But again, the book is called The Case for Faith. It's been around a while. Let's see, 2000, so it's been around 20 plus years, which means you can probably find it used places. I know you would enjoy it, because it's not just Lee Strobel. It's some of the best minds in apologetics that get to interact with him and get to lay out reasons why we can trust the Bible. Well, I thank you very much for this podcast, listening to this, and hope you have a great day, and we'll do another one soon.